Off strong. All right, we are live. It is January 2nd, 2015. It's our first Hangops of the GNU year. I believe it is the year of GNU Linux on the desktop. That's what seems to be the case. Well, I don't know. Everyone who seems to be switching to Linux seems to be using Arch, so I guess it might be the year of systemd on the desktop. Whoa.
Now I think you're just trolling. Like,
if we say
on the desktop, but systemd on the desktop, really? Come on now.
If we say systemd 3 times, will John Vincent show up?
If we wait long enough, systemd will have its own desktop, so it's cool.
Yeah. Systemd-desktop D. Systemd-butts.
I think that's what the D stands for, desktop.
System desktop. Yeah.
As long as it looks better than CDE, I'm happy.
Yeah. So, hey, everybody. Supposedly, we're going to discuss peak cheslock at some point. I don't know. He asked about Hangops on Wednesday, so we decided to make the topic about him, but he'll be here at some point. In the meantime, hi. Who we got here? We got Chris Weber. And Jesse, I think you're coming in from mobile, right? Jesse? It's Frazzle,
yeah,
right?
I'm on my computer, but the wireless is pretty sketchy, so the video will probably go out.
Nice. No, it's Frizzell, right?
Frizzell, yeah, sorry.
Okay, no. I was going to think like Frizzelli, I don't know why. Anyway, and Mark Briaco. What's up, man?
Hey guys.
It's been a while since you've been on here.
It has been a while. I'm glad to be back. It's fun.
So speaking of which, I think over the holidays you made a pretty big announcement, right? You're switching things up this year. What's going on with you?
I don't know, man. Yeah. So the announcement you're talking about is that the 15th of January will be my last day at DigitalOcean, and I'm gonna take a few weeks off and sort of think about what's next. I'm kind of not sure what I'm gonna do next, honestly. It's a little scary, but it's also kind of fun. So we'll see where it goes.
Cool. So what were you up to at DigitalOcean? Like what's been going on over there? It seems like they've had a big year.
It's crazy, right? I mean, we have over 10,000 servers and 9 data centers around the world. We're the third largest hosting company on Earth. SRE team grew by something like 400%. The network engineering team grew. My hardware engineering team exists now, which it didn't before. So we've been up to a lot. Customer growth is crazy. We've added 3 or 4 data centers with another one coming in Germany soon. So things were just out of control. In a good way, right? The growth is phenomenal. Customers seem to like it. We've got a new CTO coming on, actually on Monday, that everybody's pretty excited about. So, in terms of growth, in terms of all that kind of stuff, it's been pretty fun. Yeah, so Dio's just growing like a weed.
Just a quick shout out to the folks over there. So with sysadvent around the corner, I pinged Jill, and I can't remember how to say Jill's last name. Shillery?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And was like, hey, you guys should sponsor and do stuff for the people that are part of sysadvent. And she basically, I think I hit her up over Twitter on a weekend. By the time Monday rolled around, I had contact info, and by that following Wednesday, I had we were able to do credits for everyone that was either an editor, really anybody that participated in sysadvent this year, which was just super cool.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of thing that we like to do. DigitalOcean is very much focused on developers and on, trying to be a part of people's learning, right? That's one of the things that I really liked about Dio when I joined. You look at the community site on Dio, if you search for how do I set up X on Linux, like the first link is almost always on a DigitalOcean funded article. So that's one of the things that's really nice. DigitalOcean pays people to generate content to teach people how to do different things on Linux and how to set up their WordPress blog, or how to set up MySQL in Tunit, or all kinds of different things. How to set up an OpenVPN server, whatever the case may be. There's tons and tons of articles and content around that kind of stuff. So it's pretty cool. It's fun because seeing people learn and get exposed to that in a different way than when I was learning this actually having resources available that aren't angry people in IRC is kind of interesting.
Yeah, you know,
Excuse me, Mark. That's not actually a question. You need to rephrase that in the actual question.
Yeah, exactly. That's the IRC world.
did you spend 42 hours reading the FAQ and the backlog? No. GTFO, noob. You know, it's funny actually mentioning the community side. I noticed, I feel like more and more when I'm Googling like random Linuxy stuff, it either seems like I end up using, like, I end up seeing, at least in the top, is like a DigitalOcean community article or the Arch Linux wiki. It seemed to be like it used to be like everything was like, what is it, cybercity.biz or whatever, that kind of
Oh god, that was
site that
that
actually
was
had,
horrible.
actually has a surprisingly amount of like useful snippets on it, but it is a weird site. But like that used to always seem like to be in the top, and then random Stack Overflow. But now like those two definitely seem to be more and more creeping up there, which is kind of interesting in
Yeah.
terms of like stuff I actually end up using, like a snippet of something. Or,
I vote that DigitalOcean work with MDN to get the W3 schools articles off the Google front page, because man, like, you want to talk about an area where it's like, oh my god, really? Come on now.
Why do you hate the blink tag, Christopher Weber?
I don't know.
I love the blink tag, but it has no place in the modern web.
Well, I remember when Experts Exchange used to be the big one.
Yeah.
Gosh. So, well, first of all, yeah, secondary shout out to DigitalOcean for helping sponsor sysadvent. That was really cool. And for also being like, it seems like pretty relaxed. Like, it's interesting, some of the stuff. I found a guide where you could boot up a Debian 7 droplet and turn it into an Arch machine. It's like a shell script. It actually works. I tried it.
Nice.
Because like
that's
Arch,
because we stopped supporting Arch.
yeah, as like an official one, which I understand why, but it's kind of amusing that actually worked. It booted after the drop. I was like, what the heck, I'll try it, and the droplet booted afterwards. Pac-Man was happy. But yeah, it's been interesting to see the rise of Dio, and just sort of let, like, you know, sitting in the middle of like a lot of VPS provider type feelings, but with some of that, like, more like, I don't know, cloud kind of, you know, the elasticity and how it's become so popular. I think just things like, you know, Test Kitchen and Vagrant, like, it's really come up with those tools, and it's definitely made it easy to create and destroy and have pricing that makes it really attractive for a lot of people to not even bother with, like, you know, a local VM.
Yeah, I mean the reality is, right, people got interested in Dio to begin with because, number one, we had SSDs, and number two, the cheapest plan was $5. It makes a lot of sense. $5 is an impulse buy. It's, if you're experimenting with something, it's not too much for you to chuck out there to experiment with something and still get a reasonable performance. You know, it's not like a T1 Micro or something. It's actually a usable system. So I think that's really why a big part of why we've been so successful. The community's been fantastic as well. The community articles really help. And, you know, I don't know, I think Dio came around at exactly the right time to gain traction. We disrupted things a little bit with the SSDs. Now everybody has SSDs, so that's less of a differentiator, and we have to work a little bit harder for it, but it's still been going really well. So
There's a simple differentiator. When I contact support, someone actually responds.
yeah, that's definitely something that happens.
So one of the interesting sort of, I'll use the word challenge maybe for Dio, and you know, some of the other, I think there's smaller companies trying to do similar things, you know, maybe based on top of Docker, but like sort of mixing the more, like, you know, VPS-ish looking stuff with the API driven, with the by the hour billing. And obviously, you know, you can only speak so much to roadmap and stuff, but you have seen how the sausage is made. But some of the things that I think make AWS and now GCE compelling is a little bit of these sort of like more, I don't know, maybe call them enterprisey type things, like the load balancing, the complex private networking, VPN connectivity, some of that stuff to where you've got more complex sort of infrastructure layouts.
Yeah, I think I totally know where you're going. I think that I think what you're going to see out of Dio over the next year is more. It's not going to be a shift to suddenly be really focused on the enterprise. But what you are going to see is a lot of work and a lot of releases around, let's call them primitives, right? Building more of the primitives that you need in order to compose the kind of architecture you need to support your apps. Right now, we have a compute product that's pretty decent. And that's kind of where it starts and ends, right? Today we have a compute product that a lot of people like. We've got pretty good performance. We've got SSDs. We've got a lot of features that people like. We've got a great API. We've got a simple control panel. We've got the hourly billing you talked about. We've got good support. But we don't have a lot of the other primitives that people want around storage, around networking, around those kinds of features. And we're definitely aware of that. So you're going to see a lot of energy over the next year focused on that. Obviously, I can't talk about specifics, and it'd be wildly inappropriate for me too, since I'm leaving in a couple weeks. But I think you'll see a lot of energy there.
Yeah, and I was just sort of curious from looking at the industry, like what do you think the must-haves are for cloud providers going into the next couple of years? And I think mostly we see GCE and AWS innovating and pushing each other, and Azure is in this weird sort of third place with so much of their stuff still being like GUI driven. But what do you think like the kind of the critical primitives are? Can you comment that way a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm just to be clear, so that everybody who's following along at home, I'm speaking for Mark Imbriaco and not for Dio. This is just kind of my view of it. I don't have anything to do with product direction there. So for me, it's you got to have a solid compute service. It needs to have things like metadata support, which we finally have at Dio, which is great. You need to be able to bring your own images that aren't just a prescribed list, which is one of the problems we have today, in my view. You need to have some more flexibility around storage. So things like EBS, we all love to complain about EBS, but having a block storage device that you can attach to different compute nodes and move around is really handy, it turns out, especially if you can solve some of the performance issues. And with modern networking and performance characteristics of systems today, it is actually a tractable problem. You need to have networking that lets you do things like move IP addresses around, lets you build ad hoc networks, a la VPC from Amazon. VPC, I've said on Twitter a lot of times, is probably my favorite product from AWS. The combination of VPC and Direct Connect from AWS is magical. If you run your own data center and you need extra capacity and you have the ability to direct connect to AWS and run VPC, you now have someone else's cloud infrastructure as an extension of your network, and that's super powerful. So I think that those are really the key ones. I think solid storage offerings, so object storage is obviously a must, some sort of shared block storage, and advanced networking features like you talked about. The place where I'm not so sure, and Amazon has been doing a lot of really interesting work in, is moving up to stack, right? I'm not sure how valuable those things are. On one hand, they're certainly valuable. On the other hand, the more you move up the stack, the more you add features that are really services of their own, like databases and those kinds of things, the more you generate lock-in. And I think a lot of customers are rightly kind of wary about that, myself included.
Well, and I think that those features, when you start to have those discussions, it becomes that risk trade-off, right? Like where are you trading off the risk of running it yourself versus the amount of people it takes to run it? So perfect example, a lot of times I'm just going to use RDS because, frankly, I don't have the people with the MySQL or Postgres skill set to actually run that on top of AWS in a way that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, so to be fair, I think RDS is a great counterexample to what I said, right? Because RDS really is effectively just MySQL or Postgres. You could duplicate that yourself pretty easily. Where I think you might get into trouble is when you use some of the other things, like maybe Dynamo, like maybe SQS. things that may not have a direct analog that you can just move to, right? If you used RDS and you decided you wanted to move your infrastructure, it's just setting up MySQL or Postgres somewhere and moving your data into it. It's not the end of the world. It's the things that are a little more special, that are a little more secret sauce to Amazon that I think you might get into a little trouble. To be fair, lots of people use those things, so I could be wrong.
And I think there's a couple of things. I think one, Amazon was a very, very early first mover in a lot of the I think it was second and third level abstractions, like something like or RDS or ELB. I think it was a second tier abstraction, and something like maybe Dynamo or SQS or the new stuff like Code Deploy and Lambda and stuff are third or even maybe fourth level abstractions in terms of how much you're putting into the black box, how much you're letting it just worry about for you. And I'm not sure it makes sense for most of the other people who are trying to be in the cloud provider space to do much into the second level. I think layer 4 and layer 7 load balancing is probably the big one that a lot of the other providers need. At that kind of abstracting something that in some ways isn't hard to build, but it is hard to build maybe at scale and automate at scale. It's easy to stand up one HA proxy box.
Mm-hmm.
But, to make it easy to have a bunch of them with SSL certificates and good ciphers and and maybe you put anti-DDoS stuff in front of it and all that kind of secondary stuff and failover, that becomes a lot harder. You have to start gluing together Chef and Console and your own sort of stuff. But I do think between the first mover and from what I understand, a lot of what we've seen come out of Amazon with these higher level composition services are a lot of it is externalizing stuff that was built internally. So there was expertise. A lot of these things were built in one form or another internally, and now it's turned into an external service. So there's this years of internal expertise that was then turned into a product, trying to play catch up with that, I think, is a lot harder.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that was where these more speculative products came from. I'm mixed on it, right? I think a lot of these things like Lambda and some of the more speculative things they're doing are super interesting, and they're moving the industry a little bit, which is great. But if I were building an infrastructure on top of it and I had to consume it, I would be concerned about putting all my eggs in that basket. Maybe it's okay though.
Well, and arguably, Mark, I think that's your background, right? When I see this, I see big enterprise and I see Oracle, right? You go down this path of, well, we're going to use the Oracle database. Well, you know what? We'll go ahead and go to Oracle for the application server because that kind of works. And then, oh, you know what? We'll do their web server. Oh, they've got this clustering software too. And, we bought into the entire package, so we got all the things. And it's cool. And I think that's what we're seeing with Amazon, where it's you've got companies that are well, we kind of just want all the things, so give us all the things. And you, as a result, and they build this product out, and it's not because they're necessarily core products as much as it is when they send in people to do consulting, they can then use their own products to build out those things and bill for those that you build out recurring revenue around things that, arguably you may already be doing or aren't super hard to maintain in some concepts.
Yeah, I think they're great features. I think the Oracle example is really apt, right? Those people that buy into that ecosystem get a lot of benefit until they realize that they don't have any choice but to stay with Oracle the next time the renewal comes up, and they realize how much money it's going to cost them. That is a really familiar refrain, which is part of the trouble that I have with it. That's not to say that it's not appropriate for a lot of companies in a lot of stages of their lives. I think those tools can give you a ton of leverage, and obviously I think the cloud is pretty cool. I just worry, right? If you build your entire business around something that locks you in, then you're locked in. It makes it really difficult to change later. Maybe that's okay, depending on the stage your business is in. It's all a matter of weighing risks and balancing what you're getting out of it. I feel like I'm dominating this conversation though, and I want to hear from Jessica.
From me?
Yeah.
It's hard. I actually use a lot of the different cloud providers just because it's usually I need something different from each one. It's nice that AWS has really all the options to provide. Windows even I just spun up the other day. But I also do hear that DigitalOcean is going to expand that kind of stuff, so that's cool. DigitalOcean is a lot cheaper too, which is awesome. So yeah, I mean, I don't really have an opinion as long as it's easy to spin up and easy to replace a kernel, which actually is kind of hard on DigitalOcean.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's, as both Chris and Mark have illuminated to a little bit, there's an interesting divide between what maybe we can call like enterprise computing, which is much more, I think, used to dealing with like proprietary solutions, vendors, VARs, sales cycles, that whole sort of thing, and probably is a lot more the experience of coming to AWS and having a selection of these higher level services to choose almost in an off-the-shelf way, right? Oh, I want a SQL database. Well, there's RDS. Which flavor do I want? Oh, we're supposed to use an eventually consistent thing. Well, there's a DynamoDB. I need something that looks like Jenkins. Well, there's I can't remember what they call that piece. There's the three new ALM things. There's code deploy. There's a Jenkinsy thing. There's a deploy thing, and then I don't know. There's and those are actually the three new code asterisk things that I call ALM. From what I understand, are very deeply inspired by tools that were built internally, in terms of how services are packaged, dependencies are managed, and stuff inside Amazon. I have a couple friends who were formerly at Amazon that they're like, oh, I miss those tools. When they saw this come out, they're like, woohoo! That's that old really cool stuff that nothing else was here. But it's interesting. I think there's a couple things, right? From your point of view, Mark, is one, you're coming from a background where you've been trying to build stuff largely on open source tools, as well as you have done a fair amount of service provider oriented stuff, right? You sort of went SaaS, PaaS, IA, IaaS.
I think e-commerce
right?
too.
Well, I'm thinking from Basecamp to Heroku to DigitalOcean, sort of in that.
Yeah.
I guess Living Social was e-commerce too, but going sort of you've been moving down the stack. I think the further down the stack, and especially in the web world, we do a lot more open source. I was talking to somebody even at Lookout, almost the entirety of our SaaS infrastructure is all open source. The proprietary stuff is around the edges, but there's some Active Directory, some ESX, some bits here and there, but the majority of the actual what our infrastructure, right, our SOA is built on is all open source components.
Right.
And in that world, and also if you come from a background where you're a little more used to composing the infrastructure yourself, that having more of that sensitivity to lock in, I think, is natural.
That's interesting, right?
Okay,
I think.
so I'm going to take us.
No, go ahead, Chris.
So I was just going to point out, Brian Cantrill wrote an article earlier this week called "Fin," as in he's finished. I'm not sure what it actually means, but he got into this really interesting discussion of no one is actually innovating at the low levels, and no one seems to, frankly, give a shit about what's going on at the OS level and at the kernel level and those things. And it would be interesting to hear.
That wasn't Brian's blog post, actually.
Yeah, so
Okay,
he linked to it, but that was it's Kevin. I can't remember how to pronounce his last name. He was the dtrace author, wasn't it?
It was an engineer who worked on a lot of Solaris stuff back in the day in dtrace and was a joint engineer who is retiring effectively from tech and is sort of dissatisfied with the state of the industry. I think he's got a lot of really good points, but I think that I don't know. I think things are pretty exciting right now still, so I'm not ready to hang it up quite yet.
Makes sense. And thank you for clarifying, because I was kind of sad when I thought it was Brian Cantrill that was leaving. I was like, no.
Oh, we've reached peak cheslock.
Hello, everyone. Howdy.
Hey, Pete.
Man.
What's going on? Happy Friday.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
Yeah, and congrats, Mark, on the fun employment.
Thanks. Starts in a couple weeks, so I'm pretty excited. Get some rest and do some deep thinking about what's next. I don't know.
I'm jealous. The 2 months I took off was a lot of fun. Just no work email, no like, oh, I got to check in on this when I get back. There's no back.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna have. It's probably not gonna be 2 months for me. I'll probably get distracted and bored too quickly for it to be 2 months. But I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, awesome. Very cool.
So we were talking about the cloud.
Oh man,
Okay.
I like the cloud.
What do you like the most about the cloud, Pete?
Sometimes it's there, I guess. It kind of works, I guess. Yeah. Any cloud in particular?
So we were talking about a big part of the conversation before you got on was around the cloud and sort of how do you think about the cloud as the features in the different IaaS providers sort of move up the stack? They move from sort of primitives like block storage and networking features into things like Lambda. Like, what's your thought on using those services that may only exist on one cloud, for example? Is that okay or is it not? I'm sort of I'm skeptical because I hate lock-in, and Chris and Brandon seem to be more in that's really cool because you don't have to build it, can't. So.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Yeah, it's interesting because like at a few places I've worked, there's always been kind of the corporate mantra of, oh, well, we may not be on EC2 forever, or what if we have to support some other cloud, and so yeah, Mark, I'm like totally in your camp where it's like I kind of don't want the lock-in because usually like if I get locked in and use all the fun bits like CloudFormation and other things that help me build my stuff, and then it's like some executive is like, hey, we just signed this deal with a 3-letter company, and they said we have to go to their cloud, and now you have to kind of rewrite everything over again. It's definitely a pain.
Or their cloud is going to be down for 48 hours because of maintenance. To upgrade, as I think it was Ken White tweeted about that, Verizon's enterprise cloud.
Yeah, that reminds me of the really early, and I think if Lucis was here, he'd have some good comments too, because I know him and I both were running into the same issues. But the first iteration of the IBM Smart Cloud, is what they called it, was a very first version, and trying to deal with their stuff, and kind of going from Amazon, where most things kind of work, to something where like we didn't have block store, or actually they had block store, they didn't have an object store. They really just had compute. It was really like V0.1 or something. But yeah, some of the new bits on EC2 that I'm kind of curious about that I want to play with. I just got an invite to the container service, which I definitely want to check out. Some of those I actually look at more of like a really great way to kind of mock out new services. During the holiday, I actually played around a little bit with kind of the state of the passes, I guess. I don't know what we're calling them now, but like the Mesos and CoreOS and Kubernetes and stuff. And so I played around with those a lot, and they're all pretty cool, except they have like kind of terrible UX right now. It's like, oh, you want to run a container, like post this JSON to this endpoint, and good luck, it might run. I don't know. I feel like there's like a layer of abstraction there, which is like one too many. I'm like, okay, so I posted this thing, but I have to manage the backend. It's not like Heroku where I can just post it and it does run, and it's someone else's problem.
So there's a really interesting, maybe quite an elephant in the room here, but something that we are skirting a little bit, which is there's a high cost to the expertise necessary to be cloud agnostic, especially when you're small. But there's also a really high cost to try to engineer yourself, there's a really high cost to the engineering challenge of suddenly your thing blows up and your performance demands now exceed the ability of the black boxes that you've built on, right? The abstractions you've built on. If you've chose to do hosted abstractions, maybe you've hosted message queue or hosted storage, like the beyond the compute network block storage, right? Like on Heroku is a good example. Like all of a sudden, your stuff is just it's not scaling well on Heroku anymore, or it's getting really expensive to scale. right? So there's two sides to it. Where on the one hand, like when you're small and you're trying to you don't have the expertise to like build it all yourself. You want to use all the abstractions and all the things that can lock you in, but and for many companies they never exceed that. But then there's this threshold you cross, where then all of a sudden it's like, you really need. It's going to be a lot cheaper to build it yourself if you have the expertise.
Yeah, I think the reality is almost no company is going to get to the point where they can't reasonably scale on top of the black boxes, right? Heroku and the companies that do very likely wouldn't have gotten to where they were if they had to worry about building the right infrastructure the first time. So don't get me wrong, I am worried about lock-in, but most of the companies that I think about and most of the places where I've been recently have already been at scale. We're past that beginning point. If I were starting something new, you can bet that I would start it on something like Heroku or something that's going to give me a lot of leverage that I don't have to mess with as I want to build the product and decide if I'm actually building something that makes sense. As I scale up and I get customers and I reach those kind of inflection points where I can afford the expertise I need and frankly it matters if I'm up more, then I start thinking about what that means for the business. But again, it's a business decision. So I wouldn't get too hung up on that in the early days, and most companies rightly don't. But I think that there are times when companies certainly go too far when they should have ejected from the black boxes a little earlier, maybe.
Are there any engineering patterns that can be applied to like mitigate the lock-in, or are there any like canaries or smell tests that you've seen of like this is an inflection point on which we like start to know that we should get off this, or how do you what can you do like defensive engineering, sort of like defensive driving?
That's a great question. I think it's all about building composable applications, right? If you go down the path of building composable applications that are made of smaller services instead of building big monoliths with big databases and so on, then you have less lock-in. If you build all these components and each one can be replaced, this is sort of what Twitter did when they rebuilt themselves, right? They decomposed themselves into smaller pieces, rebuilt those pieces one at a time, and ultimately were a huge success story in overcoming one of those problems, right? They built systems that didn't scale well to begin with, and they had to overcome that. So it's totally possible, but
yeah, I remember hearing a story back in, it would have been 2011, I think, or even 2010 at this point, but it was one of the S3 product managers, and they were basically like, yeah, within the last 12 months, we've essentially rebuilt from the ground up S3 like 4 times, and that was, they were a good 4 years into the scale at that point, so you're talking pretty non-trivial type of work, but this was actually the beauty of the way in which they built by just exposing these APIs, in that as long as they kind of maintain those APIs, whatever you do on the underlying, is on you. Like, so you can start with, maybe you just swap out like 1% of the systems doing something else, right? And then do those canary tests or A/B tests and things like that. But I think that's something that, Jason Dixon has told me many times, where it's like, whenever it's like he's like trying to do something, he's like, well, you just like expose an API and you put a dashboard on top of it, right?
Yeah, here's the thing though. Your question is a really good one. It's what defensive techniques do you use? And I would suggest that maybe you don't use any of them to start with. Maybe you do exactly what Twitter did and you build a monolithic Rails app. Because until you ship something, you don't have any value. If you just spend all your time worrying about building the perfect architecture and composing things to the right abstractions and building the right APIs, you're never going to get anything done. So I think that there's a really interesting balance that you have to find there, and that just comes from having experienced engineers and good leadership, really.
Yeah, it's never perfect. It's always broken.
The focus needs to be on the product, not on the technology, especially early.
Oh, yeah, that's the truth.
So, Pete, you're at a startup, right? You guys are early, doing interesting stuff, and you're doing security stuff, which I imagine has some interesting data throughput challenges. Can you talk a little bit about how, what you guys are doing? Like,
yeah.
What abstractions are you using, infrastructure, and just like what kind of engineering practices do you apply?
Yeah, totally. So when I started, it was July of this year, And when I came on board, it was pretty much there's probably 10, 12 people here, one other ops person. It was still pretty much a kind of bootstrap small team. Everyone is, kind of pitching in and doing different stuff. And pretty much when I came on board, they were running, a couple dozen Amazon instances with their closed beta. So they were actually running closed beta up until reInvent is actually when we officially launched. So, and the closed beta was nice because it allowed them to really, test out different things and ease on, new people who wanted to try it and not, go crazy and just open it up for everyone and then kind of have to deal with that after. But pretty soon, when I came on, we were at the point where we were already seeing kind of architectural issues and scale issues. And so we basically started kind of breaking out certain pieces. I have to say, I'm incredibly lucky in that, the architecture as they built it already was pretty broken out. I mean, there's a lot of small, I'm not going to use the microservice term or whatever, but there are just a lot of small services that are running around on different systems. So it's pretty easy for us to take specific ones and say, all right, we want to try deploying this in a different way, or what if we, instead of processing data like this, we process it in some other way. And so we can do that kind of easily, which is pretty nice. But about a month after I started is when we learned that we were actually going to have the opportunity to launch at reInvent. So I think originally we were going to try to, go into a limited beta by the end of the year and general availability sometime in 2015. But then when we learned that we could launch at reInvent, kind of the whole timeline changes dramatically. And this is, you can plan for everything. You can plan for, we're going to have this amount of scale, and then we're going to do this growth, and we're going to have 6 months to do it. But there's always going to be something that's going to totally change kind of your whole scope of things. And so we essentially had to throw a lot of stuff out the window of our plans. And what we ended up doing in kind of our first iteration was, let's just build something that is let's keep it simple. We don't need to go, we could do a lot of stuff with, some of the Amazon tooling, and we could do the Packer and build AMIs, and we could do a lot of that. Or we could let's just get simple config management, build some boxes, drop some apps on there. We tried to make some smart decisions around how we package our software to release it and getting those out there and making it very easy to rebuild systems and stuff like that. But we were basically at a point where we had a beta that we had to move off of and onto a new stack, and we had to kind of build it all within 2 month time period. So for us, at least, there wasn't a lot of room for kind of new and fancy. It was let's just build something easy. And so I kind of look at the way we built our infrastructure to be the infrastructure that I built 4 years ago, where it's just use Chef, a Chef server, Chef search, rendering out templates and config files. The beauty, though, is that it works. It works great. It's simple, and that's the key thing. But because we made those kind of design choices, the second we kind of did our launch and release, we immediately sat down and said, okay, what? And this is actually a huge benefit to the to the executives and the leadership. Kind of what Mark was saying is that you have to be able to stop and say, okay, we've made these decisions, these design decisions to meet a specific deadline. So how are we going to go back and actually solve some of those architectural decisions? And so that's actually what we're doing now. Is we're basically sitting down and saying, all right, what are some things we can do in Q1 that make it a little bit easier to do rolling upgrades, right? So instead of having to rebuild the stack, which is something we probably won't do, we're going to just rebuild pieces of it. But every time we rebuild these pieces, we're going to try something new. So my next thing is basically let's play around with Docker. Everyone's talking about Docker, so let's toss some stuff in containers and use that as a way to ship our some of the services. See if we're getting performance increase or decrease, or what effect does it have on the system. But yeah, for the most part, our stuff is actually pretty, I look at it as pretty basic. It's a few hundred systems, and we're kind of using the grab bag of stuff like everyone else uses. Got some SQL, got some NoSQL, all the fun stuff, all the databases. We got a lot of daters.
So, Jesse.
Yeah.
You're on the Docker core team, right?
Yeah. Totally.
Now, I know it seemed like in some of the discussion last month, especially with with Rocket and all that coming out, and there was this thing about Docker and modularity, and I know that Docker as a company you've added Swarm and Machine and right. There's talk about plugins and networking, and so I'm just curious how the sort of engineering challenge of taking like a web application, a web infrastructure, and scaling it out compares to taking like what sort of is like, you think of it like a single piece of software, but really is like a lot of small pieces of software working together, and in some ways I think maybe some of the same challenges, just within it's not as many machines involved, but it seems like some of the same engineering challenges with like modularizing Docker and as Docker scope grows. Like, how do you think that compares?
I guess it's really just listening to the community and what they want to see happen to Docker. If they want, things to come into the main binary and like daemon or be like separated out. So I don't know. I mean, plugins will help a lot with stuff like that, so people can implement whatever they want to happen, based off like a container being started or whatever, almost like a webhook, but for a plugin. And I think that will also be awesome for networking, because then people could do things like VXLAN, multi-host setups. Yeah, I don't know about like the scaling issues though. It's mostly like we decided that like scaling Docker out was going to be like separate binaries, like with machine and swarm. So I guess that kind of solved the problem. Not sure though.
Okay. I guess it, from a high level, to me, it seems like it's similar sort of design principles. Like, all right, this was monolithic. Now we're making it non-monolithic and defining interfaces, like well-defined interfaces. That kind of same pattern, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. Like interfaces for plugins to interact with are going to be awesome. But yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think you're right, Brandon. There's a lot of parallels, right? It's all just good engineering.
Are there any challenges from the point of view of, like, I know, right, supposed to be one of the big upsides of using Go, right, is like, whoo, it's just one binary. Are there any challenges around that as you foil them out? Like, is the interaction between like machine and swarm, other things that aren't part of the Docker binary, do those all happen over like REST, or do you use like sockets, or like how do you even, like, I don't even really know, how do you sort of design those things and figure out like what makes sense for that stuff?
So both of those interact with the remote API of Docker, which is actually how the Docker client works as well. So the Docker client has the daemon side of it, and then it has the actual client side of it that connects through the remote API to the daemon. So it's kind of like the same thing. It's just a separate binary. It would almost be like if we separated out the daemon as a separate binary from the client itself. All of it interacts through the remote API.
Okay. I'm not sure where else to take that. I had another question or something, but it went away. So I guess, well, this is maybe an interesting question for you, Jesse, and I know maybe being focused on the core team, you're not involved in this as much as other people within Docker, but as a company who has been initially focused on, I guess we could, like a product, right, an open source piece of software, but is also now trying to encompass, right, services, right, the hub and the registry and the enterprise stuff. Do you see any challenges there? Is there any are there any like other demands that come from the SaaS side of the company that start to affect the like product side, or the like the engineering, writing the code side, like design of Docker itself?
So actually, I think like this is an important thing that we need to make more public. The people who work on Docker core are completely separated from the rest of the company. we are not influenced at all by them. It's like a concern that a lot of people have. Like, even though we are employees of Docker itself, we are a completely separate company, like with our own, like even AWS account for spinning up servers. Like, there's like no really interaction. So I don't actually know what's going on the hub side of things. Yeah, like every single change that they want to make to Docker itself comes in through a PR, and we review it just like all the others. And if anything, I almost think that we're more harsh on those because they're like these huge patches, and like nobody really wants to merge it than we are on anything else. So those take a long time to get in if we decide we want it. Yeah, it's just it's kind of cool actually the way that the separation is because I'm not concerned when people are like, oh, hub is down, and I'm like, that's not really my problem. But yeah, we like try to keep it entirely separate so that decisions made like on the hub side, whatever their roadmap is, like we're not. I don't even know what their roadmap is, so we're not influenced at all by what they need.
Interesting. So that's both that's unexpected, but in a really cool way. From that's sort of my reaction to that. That's a really cool. I guess maybe it's a design decision, right? You think of it like a organizational structural one, because then they participate in the open source community the same as anyone else who's sort of basing part of their business, as like a SaaS provider or some kind of infrastructure provider on Docker. That's an interesting sort of firewall that's been put there, but I think in a really good way.
We actually call it a firewall. That's funny.
Okay.
You're right. That should be more widely publicized. I had no idea about that either, but I think it's a great structure.
Yeah, it was funny when we had a meeting with some maintainers who work at Red Hat, and they were like, we didn't even know about that. And we're like, you guys, you're like part of our team. You're another maintainer. You should know that if anyone knows it. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think sort of the other way, like it's just it's an assumption, and it'd be like it's like, yeah, we want to add this cool thing to what whatever SaaS thing we're doing, so hey, let's get that into Docker, into the daemon code path or something. Like it makes sense that you just like pop over the cubicle wall sort of and be like, hey, what's up, kind of like sort of dialogue. But having that I don't know, maybe I imagine it'd be interesting to hear that from the other side, like how that changes how they think about, you know what I mean, like their roadmap and then the direction of essentially like having influence on, now it becomes like influence on an open source project via community participation rather than via like, and I mean I imagine that's the intent of it, is to make it open source, but like that's an interesting sort of cultural. Having been in SaaS companies and hosting companies and stuff, like there's almost like that vision of like the sales guy, like, hey, can we do this? Or hey, I just promised we're going to do that. Like, you're like, what? So it's really interesting.
Yeah, I can't put their sales team or their product management or like those guys have to be really frustrated.
Yeah, I actually think that they are, to be honest, probably because it's like we don't have a roadmap really. We just have a release every 2 months. So it's not like we're trying to get in certain features for a release, and I'm sure that their things are like they want to get things merged in a certain amount of time, but if we don't see it, we don't see it. So it's not going to be merged in the release.
Right. That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's awesome for the project.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, technically, the company couldn't survive without the project, and the project couldn't really survive without the company. It's like a mutual kind of thing.
So maybe an interesting thing to chew on for the last few minutes. I don't have a great segue, but I was talking with someone when I was in San Francisco last month. I can't remember who or what, but there was an observation that was made that I thought was really interesting. I want to throw it out here. And it was that open source has taken a big turn from I think where it was like around like the early 2000s. Like we think about the first, we think of the first bubble. I think there was a lot of attention of like open source on the desktop, and the open source community was very focused on like on the desktop. GNOME, KDE, OpenOffice, Mozilla. And that somewhere along the way, it seems like most of the open source activity shifted to more of like what we think of as like infrastructure pieces, like Apache, Nginx, Postgres, Hadoop, Docker, languages, Go, Python, Ruby, et cetera, et cetera. And that's become the majority of open source. And so there's a very different kind of open source community that happens around a infrastructure sort of software, if we think of it that way, and also like things are financed in a different way. The backing happens in a different way. Just curious what you think about that sort of supposition.
Do you count as an open source project if you haven't raised a round of funding? It is kind of funny though, because like I don't know, it's like and again I think this is a separate problem that we're seeing, but it's like there's everything. I mean, it's like it doesn't matter what it is. Like if you have a database that was open source, like I don't know if there is an open source database that hasn't taken money. I mean, the people who did Kafka, right, just took some money recently. There's that stuff. I mean, Mesos, the past stuff. They've taken money. It's like, obviously Docker and a lot of these other places as well, CoreOS. And honestly, I'm really blown away, but like super happy about it with Mitchell at HashiCorp. I mean, like, if you look back to see what he built and how he got to where he did, I think he was probably the smartest one of the bunch. Everyone else just seems to have randomly taken money, but that's what little I know about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the shift is actually more fundamental than desktop to infrastructure, and I have to give credit because I heard Jeff Susna said this when we were having a conversation. He's way smarter than me, so what really changed isn't a move from desktop apps to infrastructure. It was back in the 90s and early 2000s, open source was really sort of taking commercial products that someone else had done the deep thinking about and making them available to the masses by copying them, right, in a lot of cases. I mean, KDE, GNOME, like, it's no secret those things were copies of Windows. They looked like it. They stole all their UI ideas from it back then. I mean, it is what it is. But these days, instead of having the innovation happen in the enterprise and in the proprietary software world and move into open source, it's the other way around. The world completely turned on its head. The innovation is happening on the open source side and then being productized by companies and turned into proprietary solutions that are built around those open source things. So I think that's really the shift that we've seen. It's not so much, at least in my view, it's not so much the move from desktop to infrastructure. It's the fact that open source has really started innovating rather than just copying. I mean, hell, even Linux, even all the GNU tools, all that stuff was meant to be copies of something someone else already built or designed or defined. And nowadays, open source is breaking new ground. So I think that's really super interesting. And Jeff is exactly right.
Jesse, do you have any thoughts? I think you've been involved in open source for quite a while, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's awesome that open source projects can get funding now because it almost encourages more open source work being done. It's a little bit crazy to think about, though, because even when I was joining Docker, I was like, how do they make money? Yeah, I mean, it's cool. Like, hopefully, in the long run, this all works out for everyone. And I also think that the whole HashiCorp thing is, awesome. Like, that came out of nowhere, I feel like. I was like, oh my gosh, now it makes sense. All these tools were being built for, one thing. It's cool.
Actually, I do, as crazy as it is, and again, I think it's just kind of the craziness of the market we live in right now, but it's awesome that all these open source ideas can get funding because, they can continue then to hire engineers to build and improve on the open source. And now, granted, sometimes that their mission then goes down maybe a different path, but they still maintain, their open source roots. They still, they have people that are contributing, and it makes, as a user of some of these open source projects, I actually do feel a lot better when they are, when they are funded and when they have that kind of backing, because it just makes me feel like, all right, well, they're going to be around for a while. I don't have to worry about using it, and having that, contributors suddenly go away or losing traction or anything, and you're kind of left on your own. It's like a little bit different version of vendor lock-in. I'm not sure what it is, open source lock-in or something, but.
So did open source win and free software lose then? No, I'm saying that mostly tongue-in-cheek. I don't know, but it's just there's a part of me that and I've been sort of making the GNU Year joke on Twitter and stuff with my handle and the last few days and stuff. But as someone who got pretty into this stuff in around 2000 and very into the Slashdot stuff for a long time, and just IRC and Linux, and I remember watching VA Linux and they did this big IPO and they had all this money and they were giving money to anyone who was doing anything tangentially open source. The core Enlightenment desktop development team was all on their payroll for a little while. It was just it was crazy. And then for a long time it was IBM and Sun and Red Hat were funding a lot of open source, on the back of enterprise sales. And then at some point, everything just sort of, and I don't know. I mean, I guess also too, I feel like the culture, 2001, 2002, even into the mid 2000s, was very more of a free software-y, Linux. We joke about the year of Linux on the desktop, but for a long time that really meant something. We were all really going to be using GNOME, and there was this anti-Microsoft sort of sentimentality and all these things, and then things just it seemed shifted. Apple came along and they made a Unixy sort of experience pretty easy to get and nice hardware, and then it seems all of a sudden the open source software that I cared about using shifted from being my desktop environment and my terminal manager and my audio player and all these things to my database and my web server and my language and the all of a sudden Facebook and Google and Twitter and LinkedIn and stuff are where the open source software that I'm using comes from, and so much of it's written on the JVM, and there's just all these shifts, and in some ways it seems open source usage became way more pragmatic, and we use open source for pragmatic reasons, less for I'm going to say idealist reasons. I'm using those very loosely.
I mean, I gotta feel remember the state of open source, and let's be honest, it's pre-GitHub. I mean, GitHub changed the game when it came to open source, right? Because they allowed communities to be created around these code. Let's take a gentle walk back in time to the scary pre-GitHub world where you would download from SourceForge. And have you ever been in the SourceForge mailing list, whatever discussion board area?
Let me email my patch to your mailing list.
Yeah.
Good luck. Have fun.
And remember, SourceForge was the best we had, because if it wasn't that, it was you're gonna check out some code from someone's random CVS, source and or SVN source, and then build it and pray, I guess. So, and there really was no. I mean, there were obviously there were mailing lists and there was still IRC, but those I still kind of felt were less accessible than what kind of GitHub did by putting a community and conversation around code with people. And
it's basically DevOps, right? It was DevOps for open source. It was tightening up the feedback loop.
Yeah.
Enabling the conversation. It's exactly the same things we talk about with DevOps all the freaking time.
It brought the users closer to the developers, and if you think about it, for so many years, I mean, Pulse Audio is a good example, not to throw anything that Lennart Pottering does, but being separated from your users is probably not a good thing when you're building software. If you're closer to the user, and this is the classic empathy discussion that we talk about, but the closer you can get to your users in order to understand what they're actually trying to do versus just building a thing because you think it's cool. And like I said, for better or for worse, I mean, you can go into some GitHub issues and just see the mess of upset people that, how dare your free software not work well, make it do what I want to do. But even if it's sometimes uncalled for, the people that are managing those pieces, they still see it and they can understand that there are real people on both sides of it. So I think that's really is what changed it is to get that discussion around the open source I don't know. I think that's probably one of the most fundamental, shifts, at least in my career, when it comes to software and open source. Just that one thing, which is really commendable, I say.
Yeah, I mean, there was a definite fork in the road. 20 years ago, it was almost impossible to make a living as a free software developer. Today, it is absolutely possible to make a good living as an open source software developer. That is a big part of it, and you're right, Brandon. There is a very pragmatic shift there from free software and ideology to pragmatism and getting things done and writing software. It's funny, open source, you don't have the kind of freedom to develop on your own when you care about what your users want. Like Pete's point is apt. Getting closer to your users ultimately generates better software, but you also have to put up with their crap. Free software developers who don't care about making a living, who don't care about the pragmatic side, don't care how many people use their thing, don't care how popular it gets, they have a lot more freedom to do what they want there. People who do care about those things, they gravitate towards things like GitHub. They do things like engage with their communities and understand what they want. They try to make a living at it because that's what they want to do. They don't just do it in their spare time. So the split between free software and open source has never been wider.
Yeah, I mean, we see it even with these pieces of software that we all use and no one donates to, and sadly they're the things that we most depend on, OpenSSL, PGP. I mean, these are things that are kind of critical to a lot of what we do and how we manage it. And the people who contribute to them, there's less and less people that want to contribute. It's actually quite hard to even be able to contribute to them. And, there's it actually kind of blows my mind that OpenSSL, that there's not like a thriving, OpenSSL developer community of people who are around that one. It's 15 or 20 people, I think, probably more if you count in all the contributors, but of the core at least. It's a little sad, right? Because people aren't going to do it if there's not, if they can't make a living at it, right? At the end of the day, we all have bills and we all have, things that we have to manage, but it does make it kind of sad from some of that perspective.
Well, there's an interesting, your point about GitHub is sort of interesting, and it's always what is the infrastructure that the community depends on? My time at Mozilla, some of the stuff that my team was tangentially responsible for involved, we had CVS and we still had Tinderbox running for some of the CI stuff, and it was a big challenge to kill those off because the NSS folks still depended on them, and the core NSS developers, some of them it was purely spare time, some of them it was part time, but they were a couple of them, were now inside Oracle because they worked at Sun, and I think one or two of them were at Red Hat, and they were just sort of scattered around, and there weren't a lot of them. But then it was this thing that was at the core of Firefox, right? The core of all the stuff built on Gecko for security, right? It was the old Netscape security suite or whatever NSS originally stood for. But those roots show, right, in that their infrastructure and the folks working on it are from another era. It's almost like the lightsaber quote, It was an elegant weapon of a more civilized era. In some ways, it's some ways a more idealized era. I don't know, and personally, I don't have I'm not making much of a judgment call on, we call it sort of more of a pragmatic open source. It seems to be, if not, we'll say winning, at least having the market share versus the idealist, and certainly there's a lot of ground that was paved with the Free Software Foundation, a lot of things there, but there are some interesting just observations to make about what has sort of bloomed and what hasn't, and what has the world we're in now, where there's what there's available for money to, and some of the community and cultural implications that come along with how software is released and maintained when it is open source or free in some way. And for better or for worse, I do think that some of the trends that we've seen come out of sort of maybe newer open source projects, stuff that maybe became open source more from the mid 2000s on, is trickling back down, and some of the older stuff, things like Heartbleed, right, and Poodle, and some of these other things, really kind of rocked everyone, and we're like, oh, like you said, Pete, like we realized how many people work on OpenSSL, how easy it is to contribute. Like those boats are getting rocked, stuff is getting shook up on some of that stuff that's, it's the underpinnings of everything, but is maybe still stuck in that older world, and how do we modernize it? Watching the Apache folks, the Apache Foundation and projects try to move on to Git, not even GitHub, but even just like switching to Git from Subversion, and there's a lot of stuff in the Apache world that is foundational to so much of the web world now. And so it is interesting even seeing some of those pulled into, we think of maybe the modern era of open source software.
I think anybody that does ops can relate to that phenomenon, right? It's easy to get people to do interesting and important work, or interesting and unimportant work. But try to get somebody to do uninteresting, important work. If they're not being paid, good luck. And so much of development is doing uninteresting but important work. So, I mean, I think that's really that's a big part of the challenge between people who aren't being paid to work on open source. It takes people that really care about their projects to do the uninteresting but important work if they're not being compensated for it some way. And those people definitely exist, don't get me wrong, and I'm grateful for all of them. But I think that's really where some of the more commercial open source offerings have a leg up.
Here's what I want to know, though, is so many of these open source things, especially like, I don't know if all of you know of Substack. Substack on Twitter, he's really prominent in the Node community. He writes a lot of like Node.js and JavaScript stuff. I see a lot of these things, like they all have really good websites, really cool logos and stuff. Where does all this graphic design come from? Like that's one of those. Like this is all of a sudden it felt like newer open source stuff has really good graphic design. And it's like, where did all that come from?
Is there a website where you can go? What's it called? 99 Designs. Have you ever been there? So there's a website called 99 Designs, I think is what it's called. It's where you basically tell people what you want and how much money that you'll put around that job, like $500, $1,000. And like you'll get like logos and whatever else. It's actually pretty neat. We use that, or I shouldn't say we, but like the Sensu people like Sean and stuff. I remember when we were trying to come up with like a Sensu logo. He had gone through to 99 Designs and had like 20 people respond. It was like $500, and worked out well. So, but I'm guessing a lot of people do that because they do like full, pretty pictures and wireframes and whatever.
Yeah, it's even like Heartbleed, had this like awesome logo. Like you could totally make a sticker out of that.
I think it's just people understanding the importance and value of branding. And a lot of people do this work so they can collect their internet fame. So branding your project, and that's not a bad thing. I said that, it sounded kind of derogatory. I was being a smartass, but it's not a bad thing. If that's what motivates people to deliver awesome things for the community that we all make use of, then that's fantastic. But I think people just understand the value of branding and getting awareness and momentum around their projects. Docker has one of the coolest logos out there.
Yeah, I think actually I wasn't around here then, but I think the community helped choose. And I think that I actually don't know who designed it, but it is pretty cool. I love it. The whale.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you get a whole
name
bunch of
too, right?
stuff around it.
They named the whale, right? Does it have a...
Yeah, Moby Doc.
That's awesome.
Nice.
It's like the Octocat, right? I mean, these logos and this branding takes on a life of its own. So I think it's just people becoming more aware of that and becoming more aware of marketing and, the rise of social media and all these things play into it. The changes that have happened in our world since the late 90s and early 2000s, open source is absolutely influenced by all of it.
Definitely. And I think it's interesting to stop and reflect. I figure I'll call it roughly 15 years that I feel like I've been participating in the open source community and culture, and which for me, I mean, is that's half my life. I'm on the younger side of, but I also think too, I've been in it long enough to see a couple of big cycles in the changes. We kind of everyone feel like we're in a second bubble now, but I remember watching the first bubble from afar in high school, and kind of wishing I could be a part of it because a lot of stuff seemed cool at the time. But then like I don't know, it's I just think it's interesting to reflect, and maybe it's the changing of the year and all that, holidays, everything, a time of reflection, but just like some of these trends, and then not to judge them one way or the other, but just to sort of recognize them.
Totally agree. That was, in fact, the topic of my keynote at Velocity Beijing, because I had exactly the same kind of reflective. I've been in a reflective mood for about the past 6 months, so maybe it's just I'm getting old. I don't know. I turned 40 this year, so it was cause for reflection. Excuse me, I guess it was last year.
You're about to turn 40? You just
I turned 40 last year, in fact. Not even this year anymore.
What did I say? 40 is the new 30 or something? I don't remember.
Don't believe it. It's a dirty lie. Sounds like something an old person would say.
Well, there's a whole other interesting topic though in there of like with a lot of folks who they maybe didn't really get into computing until high school, college, and they're just now coming into the industry 24, 25, 26. So that whole first like bubble and first wave, like, it wasn't really visible to them. So there's a whole like, there's a whole world there, and a whole open source and free software world there that is now sort of gone by the wayside. It's still there in the corners, but it's definitely not the mainstream. And back then, that was all there was. So there's some interesting like cultural perspective of if you were aware of that versus not, and some of the legacy, and I don't know. It's just sort of when folks who don't have any sort of awareness of that versus when you do. I don't know. I mean, just like perspective and stuff.
It's literally everything has changed in the last 20 years about technology, and I mean the internet, for Christ's sake, wasn't really a thing. It was, but there was nobody using it. In '94, when I started professionally making a living on the internet, it was ridiculous. There was, 1999, I was at America Online. We had 25 million users, and that was fully half of the internet. Think about that for 1 second. 25 million customers, and that was half the internet.
Yeah. That's
and
crazy.
Here we are. It's only 15 years later, and the entire world has changed.
Yeah, definitely.
Pretty awesome.
Fun time to be alive, yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, it's awesome. Things are moving so fast now. It's unbelievable.
Definitely. Cool. I think that's a good place. We'll wrap it up. We've even gone a little over, but I think it was worth it just for some fun stuff. So let's close with since it is a new year, if any or all of you are willing, what are you looking forward to this year? What do you want to keep your eye on? Go from left to right from my view. So start with you, Jesse, if you're up for it.
Cool. I guess, I don't know, it's hard. I started at Docker 4 months ago, and it's basically like my dream job, working on open source stuff all day. So I guess just continuing to do that, and maybe like helping out on the side on other projects and stuff that I find interesting. And Linux on the desktop.
Gonna be the year!
Containers on the desktop.
Yeah.
There seems to be a small cabal of us forming that want to try and like containerize more of the desktop-y stuff. So cool. Mark?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I think for me, the thing that I'm most looking forward to right now is the uncertainty. Right? This is the first time in my adult life I've moved from one job to uncertainty and not knowing what's next, and it's actually kind of fun to have a little bit of time to sit back and reflect for a few weeks at least on how things have changed and what I want to do next. So I'm really excited about that.
Awesome. Paul, you want to throw anything in here? You went quiet?
Sure. I guess I'm really looking forward to, I think it's due to happen, is to see like packaging and distribution sort of get a little bit shocked and brought forward. They seem to, like, especially packaging seems to be done the same way it was 10, 15 years ago, and now we've got awesome tools like FPM and Docker and other ways of packaging things. And really, packaging things is becoming irrelevant, and using distribution packages is becoming irrelevant because they're still trying to foist Ruby, 1.6 on you. So it's really cool seeing where that's all going and where it's going to go.
Cool. And last but not least, Pete, what is going to reach peak cheslock this year?
I don't know. I'm definitely gonna keep an eye on Pete Chessbot because the Markov bot there is just spits out comedy gold from time to time. But so I guess the most thing I think what I'm most interested in checking out is kind of I don't know what we're calling these things, like whatever you would call things like the CoreOS and the Mesos and the whatevers of the world, but watching that, whatever, the battle of the internal paths kind of take place this year. More so just I'm looking forward to see the kind of maturity around there. I will say though, and it's because I chat with Andrew Schaefer a lot, and he tells me about the cool stuff that Cloud Foundry's doing. So I'll be interested to see where they go with this too. I think it's a pretty prime. There's a lot of people that really want to win, and this is like the classic, like it's like when all these clouds came out and like we got to win because we had all these great new clouds that we got to use and leverage. I think this is another one of those scenarios where it's like we're gonna have this beautiful choice between all these different ways in which we can abstract kind of our compute layer and make things even easier. So that's what I'm most looking forward to.
If you keep calling it Paz, Andrew's gonna cut you.
I need a better name. I'm going to bug him and say, what is it instead?
Cloud Foundry.
Private, can I call it PPass? Private Pass?
Pete as a service?
Pete as a service.
The substrate. Let's call it the substrate.
I love that.
That's a good one.
I call it that a lot.
Substrate as a service.
Sorry.
All right, $5 million. Boom.
It's already taken. We need a different letter.
SB. SB Stas. Yeah, I don't know. I was gonna say you must Stas, sort of a mustache joke in there. Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for your time. I have kind of this crazy. We're coming into like the third year of Hangops, so and it's wouldn't be what it is without everyone who shows up and participates. So I think 2015 is going to be a good year for Hangops too. So
awesome.
As long as people keep doing cool stuff, we can keep talking about it. So, cool. All right, cool. Well, thanks. Have a good weekend. I'm gonna go find some lunch and figure out some topics for the rest of January.
Take care, everybody.
All right.
Yeah, thanks everyone. See ya. Bye-bye.